Nothing makes me more nervous than talking about giants, specifically the Kandahar Giant and the giants in Kandahar in general.
Why?
You know, mainly because when I talk to people who know things, they're very, very nervous when we get to this topic. And some of them will just flat out will not talk about giants in general, but specifically giants in Afghanistan. And some of these guys are high-level guys that worked at the Pentagon. And they'll talk rather freely with me about UFOs. But as soon as we broach this topic, it's like they literally will warn me, be careful with this topic.
What?
Yeah.
What do you make of that?
Well, I think that the topic of giants is intermeshed with the occult. That's my personal theory, because nothing else makes sense. Who cares if there's 8-foot-tall guys, right? Big deal.
Right. Well, there's 8-foot-tall humans, right? We were just talking about that young kid that's a basketball player that's 7'9", right?
There's a few of them now I've seen.
Yeah. So there's actual giants that are in public.
Right.
That like play for the NBA. And
Right.
They're out there. You could meet them.
Mm-hmm. But when I say giants, I'm talking about 9 to 12 feet tall. That's 8 to 12 feet tall I would classify an 8-foot-tall person as a giant as well, as long as they don't have gigantism.
Right.
That's a completely different thing.
Right.
Gigantism is a disability.
This Kandahar Giant story is very crazy because what's interesting about it is the people that I've talked to that have been in Afghanistan, that were deployed in Afghanistan, not just Devin, but other people, they don't dismiss it. They say, we've heard some weird shit about that place. And the thing that they always say is, you got to realize, like, Afghanistan is an old country. It's old and it's very remote. Like, most of it is very mountainous. It's controlled by warlords. And, you know, look, there's these... What are those? Are they Greek or Roman, those structures that are there that date... The Greek, they look like Greek temples that date back to Alexander the Great. Mm-hmm. And archaeologists can't study them. They can't go there because it's too dangerous.
It's one of the most remote places on the planet, specifically because it's so dangerous. You can't just go strolling around Afghanistan. I mean, it probably would be easier to go to Antarctica than Afghanistan. And
it's kind of hilarious.
So the story of the Kandahar Giant.
Yeah, let's tell the story.
This story has grown into a mythology over the years. Years ago, I was working with a gentleman named Steve Quayle, and we started a production company called Gen 6 Productions. And we were making documentary films mainly about giants, mainly on the topic of giants.
Giants as, like, referred to in the Bible, in ancient history, the Smithsonian giants.
That's right, biblical and historical accounts of giants. So I was traveling around the world investigating giants, and Steve is known for his investigations into giants. And he got a phone call from an elderly woman who told him, "You need to talk to my son. My son has a story he needs to tell you." And she had to convince her son to talk to Steve, and ultimately he did. And he was active duty. He was a C-130 pilot, active duty. He actually went on coast to coast with Steve. They went on coast to coast together, and he related his story, I believe, with George Norrie, him, Steve, and George. And then later on, we flew him into Bozeman, Montana to put him in our documentary film that we were making. And he wanted to be filmed in silhouette. He did not want his face out there, even though he knew that they're going to be able to mark him just by his voice. So he flies into Bozeman. We meet with him. He shows us his credentials. He was active duty C-130. And then he told us the following story, among many other things that he told us. He said back in 2005, he was deployed in Afghanistan and Iraq running missions as a C-130 cargo pilot. And oftentimes they would have him fly into Bagram Airfield. And these were routine missions, and so on one of these missions, he's flying into Bagram. But this time when he landed, he was met, as soon as he deplaned, he was met on the tarmac by some individuals that he describes as the babysitters. He calls them the babysitters. He thinks they were either Army intelligence or Air Force intelligence guys. They didn't tell him. But this was different because when he disembarked, they told him, no photos, no mention of this ever. This never happened. So he knew that whatever was about to happen was top secret. And he had flown classified missions before, usually retrieving Taliban guys, what he described as high-valued assets. But this was different, because there were intelligence guys on the tarmac waiting for something. And it turns out what they were waiting for was the cargo that was being delivered on a forklift to the C-130. And the pilot says that the first thing that struck him as this cargo was moving toward him and his crew was the odor. He said it smelled like musk, BO, and death. And it was extremely pungent. And when the cargo arrived, it was on an air cargo pallet, which is 7 by 9. And he could see that there was a person on the pallet in the fetal position. And this individual was so large that his hands and his feet and part of his head were hanging off the pallet. And he and his loadmaster, and there were some Marines who accompanied the pallet, who accompanied this cargo, they were actually putting their feet up to this guy's feet, this dead giant's feet, and seeing how small their feet were compared to his. Now, the giant had red hair. He had 6 fingers on each hand, 6 toes on each foot. His feet were wrapped in like a crude canvas foot wrapping. And he was solid as a rock. Again, most of his body was covered by a tarp, but the pilot and the guys around him were hitting him with their fists. And he came up to about their midsection, laying in the fetal position. And the pilot told me he was solid as a rock, this guy. And he asked the Marines, what happened? Where did this guy come from? And they told him that they had heard that there was a team that was out in Afghanistan that was looking for Taliban or something. And they came upon a cave because there was a nearby village, and the villagers were bringing food and other artifacts to the mouth of this cave. And so they thought that they're aiding and abetting the Taliban. So they went into the cave, and rather than encountering the Taliban, what they found was this enormous humanoid who killed them all. And then, according to these soldiers, they deployed another team to go look for that team. And when they found the cave, they found the traces of that other team. They were ready, they were prepared, and they were able to kill the giant. In fact, the soldiers told the pilot that the giant was eating on members of the team who had killed previously. But these new guys, they took him down, and then they had a transport helicopter come in and airlift him to Bagram.
Did you ever try to find records of who was there and casualties that were reported, deaths that were reported?
It's very difficult. The Pentagon actually released a statement some years ago, which is bizarre to me. Basically saying, in paraphrasing, the Kandahar Giant incident never happened. There was never a giant that was killed in Afghanistan.
The Pentagon?
So, yeah, it was a representative. It was like a spokesman from the Pentagon or something, or a release from the Pentagon.
Is this available online?
Yeah. They actually felt the need to debunk this.
That's hilarious.
Now,
that gets me sketchy.
Well, I believed the pilot because he was a very credible guy. He didn't want his name out there. He didn't want fame or notoriety. He was very nervous. He thought, there's a good chance that they're going to recognize me by my voice. He was on Coast to Coast AM, and then he's on in our documentary. There's a good chance I'm going to get recognized, and there's going to be some reprisal. He was nervous. Now, they weighed the giant before they loaded him on the C-130, because they have to load everything that goes onto the C-130. The loadmaster weighed him. He weighed 1,100 pounds. And they estimated his height at 10 to 12 feet tall. And so they loaded him onto the C-130, and then they flew him to Qatar. And then they unloaded the cargo in Qatar. And our pilot told me he heard through the grapevine that the body ended up at Wright-Patterson Air Force Base. He said, I don't know. That's just what I heard. So this is a first-hand account from the C-130 pilot who flew the body himself from Bagram Airfield to Qatar.
Why does all the weird shit go to Wright-Patterson?
That's a good question.
Because that's where the weird shit goes.
Wright-Patterson used to have the Blue Room. I don't know if they still have it, but they used to have a room there called the Blue Room where they had all of the alien artifacts that had been recovered and that they were studying. And it was completely off limits to anybody except for people who had access, the very few who had access. And but the Kandahar Giant, that story, a colleague of mine, L.A. Marsuli, he had another guy come to him, a different guy. We interviewed the pilot, Steve and I. L.A. had another guy come to him that was, I can't remember the details, he was a special forces guy. He had firsthand knowledge of the event as well. And we're not sure if it's the same one or a different one. If there was just one incident with the Giants or if there were multiple incidents. Now, years later, this would be just a couple of years ago because we published that film, I think, back in 2016. But just a couple of years ago, and I do have to be very careful here, I ran into a gentleman who was very high up, let's say, in the operations happening out there during the Iraq War and in Afghanistan. And this individual he'd flown a lot of missions, and he was a commander. And I asked him, we were having a casual conversation, and he starts to walk away, and I said, "Hey, you were in flying missions in Afghanistan." I said, have you ever heard about the Kandahar Giant? And his wife was standing next to me, and he's sort of walking away. He turns around. The blood rushes out of his face, and he literally goes like this to me, points to his phone. And his wife whispers, "He can't talk about that." So later on, I was able to, we agreed to meet it later on and in a very controlled environment. And he related a story to me that's the most wild story I've ever heard in my life. And I'm sorry, I can't relay it.